Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening today. Today I'm joined by Dr. Bonnie.
Hi, Emily. It's nice to be here with you.
She is my English professor and is doing this project with me, and I'm very grateful to have her here today.
It is a pleasure.
Thank you. Today we're going to talk about a Western pop culture perspective of Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war. So to begin, we want to answer the question or explore the question today. Why do so many American, British, and Western European cultures depict Russia as the bad guy, and what are the implications for the Russia-Ukraine conflict today?
Oh, I can't wait to dive in. There's so much to unpack.
For sure. First, I think we should touch on the Cold War and the fear of dormant communism in the U.S.
Absolutely. So, we are both of us far too young to remember McCarthyism and the Red Scare panic, but we've studied it in history enough to know that it was a real thing. McCarthyism was all about trying to weed out communism in the United States after the World War II, and our relations with Russia deteriorated and the Soviet Union came about.
Yeah, definitely. This was a very intense issue for the United States. As we see with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they were a couple from New York, and they were tried and executed for espionage against the United States for Russia. Do you have anything you want to add talking about this case?
Absolutely. So Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were an exception to a norm, but that case alone served as justification for a lot of panic. You see this trope emerging in American cultural texts, especially, but also British and Western European, of very ordinary looking folks as sleeper agents for Russia. So we see this a lot in action films, especially. One example that's coming to mind is the film Salt with Angelina Jolie. You have a lot of double crosses, espionage against the United States, and it's all performed by sleeper agents. And then you also have this happening in the television show The Americans, where you have this couple. Well, actually, they become a couple later, but they are posing as an American family with two teenagers, and they're all four of them sleeper agents. So you have this trope that continues to be fostered even today of espionage happening against the free world, quote unquote. And it's all using people who are very ordinary and can blend in. And I think that's what the fear raised in Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And perhaps that was done purposefully, but as a result, it's increased American paranoia, especially. The most recent example I can think of is the film The Shape of Water, where filmmaker Guillermo del Toro uses somebody who is a Russian agent trying to discover this secret. So we have this idea of national security, not corporate, well, actually, yes, some corporate espionage, but also state secrets that are at threat if we allow ordinary people to hide or pass.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, especially as you've seen the conflict now and then after the Cold War, there's definitely a rise of like anti-Russian sentiment. I know, for example, I have a friend who she was Russian when the war started. She got a lot of backlash and like hate from people being blamed for it, even though she supports Ukraine in the war, which just like didn't sit right with me and a lot of people. Um, but we definitely see that. Like, I feel like it's happening again today, seeing that sentiment as more conflicts or more tensions increase.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things we have to talk about today is the total lack of nuance in Western portrayals of Russia and Russians. And I think that what's happening to your friend is incredibly sad. And it's really important to think so honestly about what is happening and who is to blame. And I think that we have to then talk about how Western propaganda stokes Cold War sentiments, especially in the way that Russia is portrayed in media and pop culture. I remember in grad school, I had a professor who was herself Russian, and she complained, why is Russia always the bad guy? And that's a question that stuck with me to this day, and it's made me think about this like really cartoonish portrayal of villainy, particularly when you get to like James Bond films. So A couple examples that come to mind are The Spy Who Loved Me, which is all about Russian espionage and this race with Britain. And there's another oligarch in so many of the other films, and they are often very like suited up, very cartoonish, heavily accented, lots of rings, a cat on the lap, and it's all about this exclusivity and wealth and proximity to the Soviet government. And so you ultimately have the Soviet government being portrayed by these shadow characters, these autocrats, who then fight the British government vis-a-vis the Secret Service. So it's a really interesting portrayal that portrays the West as heroic and the East as very villainous and also cartoony at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. And we also see, well, like as we know, Russia has the same, well, like opposite for the United States. So it's like the United States is the bad guy. And so like the opposing sides, I feel like you have to explore both to understand both because, you know, if you're only understanding one side, you are not understanding the full story.
Absolutely, that's correct. And another place we see that play out even today is in sports. That
Mm-hmm.
sports competitions, particularly internationally, have become a metaphor for the Cold War today. You know, I think one of the most famous examples is the quote unquote miracle on ice, which I know that's not what Russia calls it, but that's what we call in the United States because we have this sort of like the big bad Russian bear versus, or the Soviet Union versus the United States in this hockey match. And here's the kicker, it wasn't even an Olympic medal game.
Yeah.
I mean, we had to eventually face off against someone else, but it was portrayed as this miracle on ice that we were the underdog and we defeated Russia in the heat of the Cold War, if you will. And Disney even made this like very dramatic, dramatized, romanticized movie about it. And at the Olympics, we still see this. I think even now, in light of Russia's offenses with doping, which we'll talk about later,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really fascinating how the Olympics have sort of heightened this Cold War tension.
Yeah, for sure. I think that Russian response after Putin's rise to power and RT or Russian television and propaganda networks and how they have affected Putin's reign and his how he's seen in the West and the United States.
Absolutely, because you look at how he is seen in Russia versus how he is seen in Western Europe, and it's a really interesting contrast. I don't know if you saw that episode of Late Night with Stephen Colbert, but he actually went to Russia and he interviewed people and asked what they thought about the United States, what they thought about Russia, and what they thought about Donald Trump, and their answers were really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them really liked Donald Trump, and a lot of them were really supportive of Putin at the time. And again, a lot of them would also say they didn't have much access to Western news.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really fascinating. Whereas I think we're seeing things like RT creep up in our own media, and especially with platforms like Twitter, Facebook, etc., and these sort of bot farms that we're seeing a social media takeover.
Yeah, for sure. Like you mentioned, like Putin has a very high popularity. Well, it's lowered now, but like generally, he's had a very high popularity rating in Russian citizens. Um, Popularity, I think it's good to mention, is that does not necessarily mean everyone loves him, though some do. It's through his means, which have included violence and fear in the past, but still he has a very high approval rating in Russia,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that has a lot to do with propaganda and social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really hard to undersell the importance that social media had. And we'll touch on this in a future episode, so stay tuned. But social media played an enormous role in the 2016 election. There was a lot of misinformation sown about the candidate Hillary Clinton, and the FBI, CIA, in their investigations found that Russia was trying all sorts of different means. And in an episode of Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, I actually watched an interview with a young man who was American, an English graduate, so real shade to the profession there. She says as an English professor. He was an English graduate and he made his money working for a bot farm.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. So it's really easy to either deprive someone of information or feed them information in such a way that it makes them think that they are in the right, or that their guy, quote unquote, is the right guy. And I think that's what we're seeing with Russia, is that Putin has controlled things so tightly, is that he's been able to manipulate a good chunk of his population and boost his popularity that way.
Yeah, and like you just mentioned, he actually has had well, there is evidence that Russia did interfere in the 2016 election.
Yeah.
And as Dr. Bonnie said, we will go into that more in the next podcast. So stay tuned, because that will be a very interesting topic to cover.
All right. So there's one more thing I feel like we should really, really dig into, and that is thinking about the Olympics now as a show of power for Russia. I touched on how earlier Western propaganda used sports as a metaphor for the Cold War, but that goes two ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have to talk about doping.
Yes, definitely.
You know, it was in 2014 that Russia was found to have participated in a statewide doping program. And doping is, again, for those who are not in the know, it is the injecting of white blood cells and other like sort of materials to sort of boost your blood and possibly give you more longevity or more stamina. It is banned in the sports world in general, and we've had a lot of cyclists, for example, all around the world who have been banned for doping.
Mm-hmm.
So, or they take medications to sort of boost their immunity, and then there's a whole list. I've read different articles, especially this last year after what happened at the Olympics, of athletes who'd say, I would have to text my testers to make sure that if they came up and surprised me at my home, that if I was at the grocery store, they would know where I was, to avoid even the suspicion. So when you have a statewide known program like what's happened in Russia, how do you then respond as a world without escalating a conflict?
Yeah, I don't know.
I know. Well, and that means we have to talk about Kamila Valieva, the 15-year-old who failed her drug test for a heart medication that was found in her blood. Initially, they denied that this had happened, and she even made the excuse that she had drunk from her grandfather's water glass.
Mm-hmm.
But how does that work?
Right, and her being 15, like being put in that position, like she's a child.
Yeah,
She
absolutely.
shouldn't have had that responsibility on her shoulders.
Absolutely. And so, how this then becomes relevant is that she drew a very polarized response, first for being allowed to skate, period.
Mm-hmm.
And then, second, for how she was talked about in the media. And I thought in America, we did a pretty good job of, as you identified, she's a child.
Yeah.
She was failed by the adults around her in a way that was just unacceptable.
For sure.
But then you have in Russia, she's being treated as a national hero by Putin himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he awarded her a medal, which makes her in Russia, I think, sort of a martyr figure.
Yeah.
Like the West made her out to be the bad guy, and she was just standing up for Russia. And I think that is a really fascinating perspective on something that the world has agreed is illegal.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that gives insight just to the Russian perspective, like the people's perspective, and how Putin is using that in their perspective to just affect like how people think and how people think about the West, because that's just yet another way to make the West the enemy of Russia, which it is, but like just to make the people even more against it and more loyal to Putin, and that's where his popularity and approval rating comes in, because by doing things like that, he's getting the people to support him in that way.
Absolutely. And it's things like that. Again, what we're talking about is not these groundbreaking things like conflict. He's using sports.
Yeah.
And I think that there is some backlash that Russia has, some resentment about not being seen as this cultured, sophisticated country. Think about it. Russia's in G8.
Yeah.
It wants to be a major world power, but I think there is still enough suspicion in the West. And now we're seeing things play out like this sort of shortcut, if you will, doping, illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's really, really fascinating.
Definitely. I think that, like we said, is a major example of just like you said, sports, like not like a major conflict, but just everyday things that we're talking about. So I think overall we've spoken about all these things, but why is it important, and why should we focus on this culture? Do you want to say what you were thinking first?
Absolutely. So I think that it's really important to raise awareness through pop culture, because pop culture tells us what's also happening on a philosophical and ideological level.
Mm-hmm.
That when we examine how we as the West have participated in this, we have to then take into accountability how we may have pushed this Cold War into a certain spot. And we may also have to examine how our portrayal of Russia and Russians may be harmful to the people themselves, who may not know how they have been sort of used as pawns by their leader.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's, like you said, it's very important to know that people in the United States and in the West have a very different perspective from people in Russia. And it's not fair to say that one side is always right if you don't know the other side and you don't know what's happening with on the other side. So I think it's important to just know about both and educate yourself on both sides and understand. Even if you disagree or you know it's wrong, just to know, because then you cannot be fully informed and make a fully informed opinion or decision based on that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
I think also we should talk about how exactly it plays into American politics and how it's affected us today and in the past.
Absolutely. I think that when we think about McCarthyism, when we think about this fear, I think that the politics in the United States became very toxic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that toxicity can persist even to this day, because with polarization of an entire people, we sometimes lack the ability to be helpful or to have actual good foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. And you mean the polarization of like Russia versus United States?
Yes, and there's certainly polarizations that happen within America too, of saying we can accept a people without accepting what their leader has done.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like I said with the example of my friend, but a lot of Russian people in the United States have faced backlash for the war, which isn't necessary. They may not agree with it, but we need to know, we need to be able to separate the Russian people from the government and just understand their perspective and know where they're coming from. As well as this podcast is based on Ukrainians and where they come from, because often Russian and Ukrainians, they may have both sides like in their family.
Right.
And so it's important to just understand where all is coming from in order to understand this war. And to support Ukraine, you have to understand the Russian side and where the Russian people are coming from.
Correct.
Otherwise, you can't be fully informed in your decision and how you will support Ukraine.
Absolutely. I think that's really well put.
Thank you.
Well, I'm excited to talk more about American politics with you, and I'm looking forward to seeing where you go next, and I can't wait to hear all the rest of your interviews. This has been a great podcast so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bonnie, for helping me with this podcast and organizing this with me. This has been a really great experience, and as she said, definitely listen. There will be more podcasts with interviews and talking about politics within the United States as well about this conflict. So stay tuned if you're interested, and thank you for listening.